Her voice was still echoing in my ears when I realized my grandchildren were already gone. Not slowly, not dramatically, just gone. I was standing in the hallway outside the courtroom, holding my coat in both hands, when I understood that whatever had just happened inside that room had not only taken my money, but had quietly rewritten my place in my own family. No one told me. No one needed to. The absence did the speaking. I stood there longer than I should have. People brushed past me with files tucked under their arms, shoes clicking against the floor, conversations beginning again as if something ordinary had occurred. I looked down at my hands and noticed how steady they were. That surprised me. I had imagined losing $18 million would feel violent, like something ripped away. Instead, it felt administrative, clean, final, as if I had been signed out of a life I no longer qualified for. When I finally turned toward the doors, I saw my son at the far end of the hallway. He was bending slightly to speak to his children, his voice low, reassuring. His wife stood beside him, one hand resting on his arm, the other holding her phone. They looked like a family protecting itself. I waited for him to look up. He did not. That was when I felt the first real fracture, thin but deep, run through my chest. I followed them outside, though I don't know why. The sun was too bright, the air too open. They stopped near the steps, and my son crouched to straighten my granddaughter's coat. I remembered buying that coat. I remembered measuring her arms to be sure it would last through winter. I opened my mouth then, not to argue, not to accuse, but simply to say her name. Before the sound could form, my daughter-in-law gently guided the children toward the car. The door closed. The engine started. My son raised his hand in a small, uncertain gesture. Then they drove away. I did not cry. I watched until the car disappeared from view. Then I sat down on the steps and waited for something to happen inside me. Nothing did. That frightened me more than tears would have. I had spent my life believing that if something mattered enough, your body would react. But my body stayed calm, as if it had already adjusted to this version of events. I went home alone. The house greeted me the same way it always had, with quiet patience. I hung my coat, removed my shoes, and stood for a moment in the entryway listening to the stillness. It felt heavier than usual, not because the house had changed, but because I had. I had come back smaller than I left. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hand did not shake. I drank slowly, standing at the counter, watching my reflection in the darkened window. An older woman looked back at me, someone careful, composed, and suddenly unnecessary. I wondered when that transition had occurred and how I had missed it. $18 million is an odd thing to lose at my age. It is not about need. I no longer needed proof that I could survive. I had survived things far more frightening than poverty. What unsettled me was how easily that money had been turned against me, how quickly it became evidence of something I was not: control, interference, influence. Words were used that I did not recognize as belonging to me, yet they stuck. I walked through the house, turning on lights I did not need. In the living room, family photographs lined the shelves. Holidays, birthdays, smiles caught mid-laughter. I paused in front of one taken years ago, my husband standing beside me, one arm around my shoulders, our son between us. We looked solid then, as if nothing could move us without permission. My husband had been gone 2 years. His absence had been loud at first, then gradually absorbed into routine. I still spoke to him sometimes, not out loud, but in the quiet moments when decisions pressed in. That evening, I found myself standing outside his study, hand resting on the doorframe, unsure whether to enter. The room smelled faintly of old books and the cologne he favored. I stepped inside and sat at his desk. Everything was where he left it. He had always believed in leaving things ready, just in case. I touched the edge of the desk and felt an unexpected sense of comfort. He would have known what to say about today. Not comforting words, practical ones. He believed in clarity more than consolation. At the back of the study, partially hidden behind a cabinet, was the safe. I had not opened it since his death. It was not secret, just private. We had shared many things, but we also respected the idea that not everything needed immediate explanation. That trust had felt like strength. Standing there now, I wondered if I had mistaken silence for simplicity. I knelt in front of the safe and rested my hand against the metal. It was cool, solid, indifferent. I did not open it. I was not looking for answers yet. I was still adjusting to the loss of questions I was no longer allowed to ask. My son had made that clear, without saying a word. That night I ate dinner alone at the table we once shared. I took small bites, chewed carefully, and cleaned my plate when I was finished. Routine is a strange comfort. It convinces you that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to prepare for. Before going to bed, I stood in the hallway outside the bedrooms that once held laughter and noise, now closed and silent. As I turned off the lights, a thought settled into me, calm and persistent. I had lost something today, yes, money, access, authority, but I had also been shown something I could not unsee. Whatever had taken my grandchildren from me had not come from nowhere. It had been forming quietly, patiently, while I trusted that love was enough to hold things together. I went to sleep knowing that this was not the end of my story, only the point where it stopped being shared with me willingly. The next morning arrived without ceremony. Light slipped through the curtains as it always had, touching the same corners of the room, revealing the same dust I never quite managed to eliminate. I lay still for a long time, listening to the house wake up around me. Pipes clicked. A bird landed somewhere near the window. Nothing acknowledged what had changed, and that felt like a quiet betrayal. I had expected the world to pause, even briefly, in recognition of what I had lost. It did not. I got out of bed slowly and dressed with care, choosing clothes I might have worn on any ordinary day. Grief, I have learned, does not always ask for black. In the kitchen, I made tea and stood by the sink while it steeped, watching the steam rise and disappear. The routine steadied me. It reminded me that my hands still knew what to do, even if my place in other people's lives had become uncertain. I considered calling my son. The thought came and went several times as I moved through the morning. I imagined his voice, careful and controlled, explaining that this was for the best. I imagined myself listening politely, agreeing where agreement was expected. The conversation felt rehearsed before it ever began, and that alone told me it would not change anything. I did not pick up the phone. By midday, the silence had settled into something heavier. I walked through the house again, not to clean or organize, but to reassure myself that it was still mine. Each room held traces of a life that had once been full. Toys tucked into corners, extra chairs around the dining table. I paused in the living room, lowering myself onto the sofa, and let my thoughts drift backward. There had been signs, I realized, not obvious ones, not the kind people point to afterward and say they knew all along. Subtle shifts, shorter visits, conversations that ended before they began. My daughter-in-law's polite distance, always respectful, always firm. She had never raised her voice to me. She had never needed to. Boundaries had appeared quietly, one after another, until I found myself standing outside them without remembering when I stepped away. I thought of the grandchildren, their faces pressed against the window of the car as it pulled away the day before. I wondered what they had been told. Children accept explanations when they are delivered gently enough. They trust the tone more than the content. That knowledge hurt in a way I could not name. It felt like something sacred had been handled without care. In the afternoon, a letter arrived from the attorneys. It was formal and brief, outlining the terms I had already heard: custody arrangements, financial restructuring, recommendations for future communication. The words were chosen carefully, stripped of emotion, as if the situation itself were a neutral event rather than a fracture. I placed the letter on the table and did not read it again. As evening approached, I found myself in my husband's study once more. I did not plan it. My feet simply carried me there. I sat at his desk and opened a drawer, running my fingers along the edges of neatly stacked papers. He had always believed in documentation, proof, preparation. It had once annoyed me, his insistence on keeping records for events that might never occur. Sitting there now, I felt a flicker of understanding I had not allowed myself before. The safe remained closed. Its presence felt different than it had the night before, less symbolic, more practical. I told myself I was not ready, that there would be time later when the shock had worn off. Still, my gaze returned to it again and again, as if it were quietly reminding me of something I had agreed to forget. That night, sleep came in fragments. I woke often, listening for sounds that never arrived. Once I reached for the other side of the bed before remembering it had been empty for years. Loss layers itself, I thought. It does not replace what came before. It settles on top, heavier each time. The following days blurred together. I attended appointments, returned calls, smiled when required. People expressed sympathy in careful tones, avoiding details. I appreciated their restraint. I did not want comfort. I wanted clarity, and clarity was slow to arrive. One afternoon, my son finally called. His voice was calm, measured. He asked how I was doing, as if the question itself might satisfy an obligation. I answered honestly, which is to say, briefly. He explained again that this arrangement was temporary, that everyone needed time to adjust. I listened, saying little, noting how easily the word temporary can be stretched to cover an entire absence. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. I did not feel anger. I felt something colder, something more instructive. Understanding, perhaps, that love does not protect you from being redefined by others, that silence, once a refuge, can become evidence against you. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I realized I had stopped waiting for things to return to how they were. The thought arrived without drama, simple and steady. Whatever came next would not include apologies or sudden reversals. It would require patience of a different kind, the kind that observes rather than hopes. After I finished eating, I returned to the study once more and stood in front of the safe once more. I did not open it, but this time I memorized its weight, its shape, its quiet certainty of its presence. Some things, I understood, are not meant to be opened in moments of grief. They wait for something else to catch up. I turned off the light and closed the door behind me, aware that whatever had begun in that courtroom was still unfolding, and that I had only just started to see where I was standing. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between advertisements and a notice from the bank. I recognized my son's handwriting immediately. He had always written carefully, as if the page itself deserved respect. For a moment I held the envelope without opening it, feeling its weight, noting the deliberate neatness of my name. I told myself it meant something. I told myself people do not write by hand unless they care. Inside was a single card, cream-colored, simple, an invitation to a renewal ceremony. Not a wedding, the card explained, but a reaffirmation of vows held in front of family and friends. The language was gentle, almost apologetic, as if anticipating questions. At the bottom, in smaller writing, there was a line that read, "We hope you can attend." No signature, just hope, written like a courtesy. I sat at the table and read it again. The date was 6 weeks away, plenty of time to prepare, to decide, to imagine what my presence might mean. I noticed there was no mention of the children, no reassurance, no clarification, only an address and a time. The invitation did not promise belonging, it offered proximity. I did not respond right away. I placed the card beside my plate and continued eating, though my appetite had thinned to something ceremonial. Over the next few days, I found myself returning to it often, picking it up, setting it down, studying the edges as if they might reveal intention. I told myself the invitation was an opening, a chance to be seen again, a reminder that I had not been entirely removed. Friends encouraged me to go. They spoke carefully, choosing optimism like a shield. They said my grandchildren would see me there and remember. I listened and nodded, grateful for their concern, aware that none of them understood the quiet calculations being made on my behalf. In the end, I accepted, not because I believed it would restore anything, but because absence can be misinterpreted too easily. Silence, I had learned, is often rewritten by those who benefit from it. I wrote my response by hand, matching my son's careful script as best I could. I wrote that I would attend and wish them well. Nothing more. The weeks leading up to the ceremony passed slowly. I chose my clothes with attention, not to impress, but to appear appropriate, neutral, presentable, someone without an agenda. On the morning of the event, I woke early and sat by the window with my tea, watching the sky shift. I reminded myself that I was not going there to reclaim anything. I was going to witness. The venue was a restored estate on the outskirts of the city, elegant without being ostentatious. As I walked up the gravel path, I could hear music drifting through the open doors. Guests stood in small clusters, laughing, greeting one another. I recognized some faces. Others looked through me politely, unsure of my role. That uncertainty followed me inside like a shadow. My son spotted me from across the room. His smile was brief but sincere. He crossed the space between us and embraced me lightly, as if unsure how much pressure was allowed. He thanked me for coming. I told him it was good to see him. We did not speak of anything else. His wife joined us moments later, elegant and composed. She greeted me warmly enough, her smile practiced, her eyes observant. She commented on my dress. I thanked her. The ceremony itself was brief. Vows repeated, applause offered, cameras raised. I sat in the second row, hands folded, posture straight. When my son spoke about commitment and trust, his voice wavered just slightly. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, not from hope, but from recognition. Public declarations often conceal private negotiations. Afterward, there was a reception. Guests moved easily between conversations. I stood near the edge of the room, sipping water, watching my grandchildren weave through the crowd. They did not come to me. Once my granddaughter looked up and our eyes met. She smiled uncertainly, then turned back toward her mother, who placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and guided her away. The motion was subtle. No one else noticed. I did. A toast was given, then another. My son thanked everyone for their support during a difficult year. He spoke about boundaries and growth, about protecting what matters most. Applause followed. I joined it slowly, deliberately, aware of how my hands sounded in the quiet spaces between claps. Later, as guests began to leave, my son approached me again. He asked if we could speak privately. We stepped outside onto a terrace overlooking the grounds. The evening air was cool. He told me he hoped I understood why certain decisions had been made. He said the children were thriving. He said this distance was necessary. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I told him I was glad he was happy. That was all. On the drive home, the estate disappeared behind me, its lights fading into darkness. I did not feel humiliated in the way others might have expected. I felt informed. Something had been clarified, not by words, but by choreography. I understood now that I had been invited not as family, but as evidence, proof of civility, a reassurance to others that everything was under control. That night I returned home and stood once more outside my husband's study. I did not go in. I did not need to. The ceremony had given me something more useful than reconciliation. It had given me certainty, and certainty, I was beginning to understand, is far more dangerous to ignore than loneliness. I turned off the lights and went to bed, knowing that whatever remained unspoken between us had just grown heavier, and that the distance I was asked to accept was not temporary at all. The morning after the ceremony, I woke with the strange clarity that follows disappointment fully understood. There was no confusion left to sift through, no imagined explanations to entertain. What had taken place was complete. I made my tea, sat at the kitchen table, and allowed the memory of the evening to replay without interruption. Each moment aligned neatly, like pieces that had finally decided to show their edges. I was not angry. I was quietly corrected. In the days that followed, the calls came, not from my son, but from people who had attended. Their voices carried careful concern, praise for my composure, admiration for how well I handled everything. I thanked them and changed the subject. Their kindness was genuine, but it landed strangely. I had not endured anything in public that required strength. What had happened was not an attack. It was exclusion, practiced gently enough to pass as courtesy. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped me on my walk. She mentioned how lovely the ceremony had been, how touching it was to see family together again. She said it must have felt healing. I smiled and agreed. The word healing hovered between us, unused. I did not correct her. Correcting people requires energy, and I was learning where mine was best preserved. That evening, I received an email from my son. It was brief, almost formal. He thanked me again for attending and hoped the event had provided some closure. The phrase struck me. Closure is something offered when a chapter is meant to end. I read the message twice, then once more the next morning. He did not ask how I was. He did not mention the children. He had said exactly what he intended to say. I replied the following day. I told him I was glad he felt supported. I wished him well. I did not mention closure. I did not ask for anything. When I sent the message, I felt a small but noticeable shift inside me, like a door being closed deliberately rather than allowed to drift shut. Weeks passed. Autumn arrived quietly, cooling the air and changing the color of the trees outside my window. I found comfort in the predictability of the season. Leaves fall, things thin out. There is no insult in it. I spent more time alone, not avoiding people, but no longer seeking reassurance from them. Loneliness, I discovered, becomes manageable when you stop arguing with it. One afternoon, a legal notice arrived by courier. This one was thicker than the others. I sat at the table and opened it carefully, smoothing each page as I went. It outlined revised financial arrangements, new trustees, adjustments made in the best interest of all parties involved. My name appeared repeatedly, always in the passive role, beneficiary, subject, considered. The language was respectful, the implications were not. I read every word. I did not rush. Understanding is often hidden in the spaces between sentences. By the time I finished, the pattern was clear. Control had shifted fully, cleanly, and with legal blessing. I was not being punished, I was being managed. That realization landed with more weight than any accusation could have. That night I dreamed of my husband. He was standing in the study, looking through papers, frowning slightly the way he did when something did not add up. He did not speak. He did not need to. I woke before dawn with the image still sharp, my chest tight with something that felt like grief and instruction intertwined. I went into a study as the sun rose. The room felt unchanged, but I was not. I sat at his desk and opened drawers I had ignored for years, not searching, simply inventorying. Old correspondence, financial summaries, notes in his precise hand. He had always believed that clarity was a form of kindness, even if it arrived too late to be appreciated. I stopped before the safe. It was not calling to me dramatically. It waited as it always had. I knelt in front of it and rested my hand against the metal. For the first time, I did not pull away quickly. I stayed there, breathing steadily, feeling the cool surface under my palm. I did not open it, not yet, but I felt something settle into place, a quiet alignment between loss and readiness. In the following days, I noticed changes in how I moved through the world. I spoke less, listened more. When people offered advice, I thanked them and did not follow it. When sympathy was extended, I accepted it without inviting more. My son did not call. I did not call him. The silence between us was no longer heavy. It was defined. One evening, while sorting through old documents in the dining room, I found a receipt from years earlier, a mundane thing, a purchase long forgotten. Yet holding it, I remembered a conversation with my husband about safeguards, about contingencies that no one ever thinks they will need. At the time, I had laughed and told him he worried too much. He had smiled and said preparation was not pessimism, it was respect for reality. I sat there for a long time, the paper resting in my hands, and felt something new shape beneath the surface of my calm. Not hope, not anger, awareness. I was beginning to understand that what I had lost publicly had been decided privately long before, that my humiliation, if it could be called that, was not accidental, it was procedural. That realization did not break me, it steadied me. It allowed me to stop waiting for gestures that would never come, and to stop measuring my worth against access to people who had already chosen distance. I stood up, placed the receipt carefully back where it belonged, and turned off the light. As I walked past the study on my way to bed, I paused. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the safe remained unopened, patient as ever. I did not go in, but I knew now, with a certainty that surprised me, that when I did, it would not be out of desperation or curiosity. It would be because silence, when observed long enough, eventually tells you exactly what it has been hiding. Winter settled in slowly, as if unsure whether it was welcome. I noticed it first in the mornings, the way the air pressed a little harder against the windows, the way the kettle took longer to boil. Days shortened, and with them the number of conversations I felt obligated to maintain. Silence became less of an absence and more of a companion, one that did not demand explanations or forgiveness. I established a rhythm for myself, breakfast at the same hour, a walk even when the cold made my joints protest, reading in the afternoon, always near the window. Routine was not a distraction, it was a form of discipline. It kept my thoughts from spiraling back toward questions that had already answered themselves. I no longer wondered why things had unfolded the way they did. I accepted that they had, and that acceptance created space for observation. From time to time, I heard updates about my son through others. He was busy, they said, focused on the children, relieved, perhaps, that things had settled. I listened without reacting. Relief is a fragile thing. It depends on the belief that nothing else will surface. I had learned not to confuse calm with permanence. The legal notices continued to arrive, spaced just far enough apart to suggest closure without ever quite delivering it. I read them carefully, then filed them away, not out of fear, but out of respect for detail. My husband had taught me that attention is a form of power. You do not have to announce it, you simply have to apply it consistently. I spent more time in his study, not searching exactly, becoming familiar. I reread old correspondence, some of it decades old, tracing the evolution of decisions that once felt straightforward. I paid attention to dates, to margins, to small notes written in his hand that I had previously dismissed as unnecessary thoroughness. What I saw was not a revelation, but a pattern. He had believed deeply in preparation, especially for outcomes that polite people prefer not to imagine. The safe remained closed. Its presence had shifted from curiosity to something closer to responsibility. I was aware of it without being drawn to it impulsively. That restraint felt important. Whatever it held, I understood instinctively that it was not meant to be opened in a moment of reaction. It required context, patience, time enough for the noise around me to fade. One afternoon, I received a holiday card from my son. It was addressed to me alone. The children's names were printed beneath his, their handwriting absent. Inside, the message was brief and warm in tone, expressing hope for peace in the coming year. I studied the card for a long time, noting what it did not say. There was no invitation, no promise, only goodwill, delivered at a distance safe enough to maintain. I placed the card on the mantel and let it remain there. It was not a wound, it was a marker. Evidence of how easily affection can be formatted when it becomes inconvenient to feel it fully. As the year drew to a close, I made a decision not to travel. Friends offered invitations, escapes from the quiet I now inhabited. I declined gently. I was not hiding, I was staying put. There was work to be done, even if it did not yet have a name. Some things require stillness before they can be understood clearly. I began organizing documents that had accumulated over the years, not just financial ones, personal records, letters, agreements long forgotten. I created neat piles, labeled them carefully, and stored them where I could find them again. There was no urgency to this process. I moved slowly, deliberately, allowing myself to notice connections rather than forcing conclusions. At night, sleep came more easily. When dreams arrived, they were quieter than before. Often my husband appeared, not speaking, simply present. Sometimes we walked together. Sometimes we stood side by side watching something unfold without comment. I woke from these dreams with a sense of reassurance I could not logically explain, not because he had left me answers, but because he had trusted me with responsibility. There were moments, of course, when grief pressed in unexpectedly, a song on the radio, a child's laughter in a grocery store aisle. I allowed those moments their space. I did not rush them. Grief, I had learned, is not an obstacle to clarity. It can coexist with it as long as you do not let it dictate your movements. One evening, while reviewing an old ledger at the dining table, I noticed an entry that had been altered, not erased, adjusted. The change was small, almost insignificant. I would not have seen it months earlier. I sat with that realization for a long time, resisting the urge to draw conclusions too quickly. Awareness, like silence, reveals more when you do not interrupt it. I closed the ledger and returned it to its place. I did not make notes. I did not mark pages. I trusted my memory. I trusted the discipline I had built around patience. Whatever was forming did not need to be rushed into language. It needed to be allowed to exist first. As winter deepened, I found myself less concerned with how others perceived my absence. I had stopped measuring my days by contact or validation. Instead, I measured them by attention, by what I noticed, by what no longer surprised me. One night, as I passed my husband's study on my way to bed, I stopped and looked inside. The safe sat exactly as it always had, unchanged, waiting. I did not enter the room, I did not touch it, but I acknowledged it, the way one acknowledges a truth that no longer needs proving. I turned away and went to sleep, aware that the quiet I had cultivated was not emptiness, but preparation, and that whatever lay ahead would not announce itself loudly. It would arrive the same way everything else had, through patience, through observation, and through silence that had finally learned to listen back. By the time spring arrived, I had stopped marking time in weeks or months. Days blended into one another with a softness that felt intentional. I noticed changes in light before changes in circumstance, the way the sun lingered longer on the kitchen floor, the way the air carried less resistance when I stepped outside. These shifts felt earned, not given. I had endured the narrowing of my life without flinching, and something in me had adjusted accordingly. I kept my routines, though they evolved quietly. My walks grew longer, my reading more selective. I was no longer consuming words for comfort, but for orientation. I found myself drawn to histories, to personal accounts of people who had outlived the structures meant to contain them. There was something instructive in their restraint. None of them rushed their conclusions. They allowed truth to arrive on its own schedule. Occasionally, my son crossed my mind without warning, not painfully, not longingly, simply as a presence that had moved to another room in my internal house. I wondered how he was, not because I planned to reach out, but because curiosity does not vanish just because access does. I hoped he was well. I hoped the children were growing. Those hopes existed without expectation. That distinction mattered. I received fewer updates from others now. People grow tired of tragedies that refuse to escalate. My story no longer had momentum for them. I was no longer falling apart or demanding sympathy. I had settled into something quieter, and quiet makes people uncomfortable. They assume it is temporary. They wait for the next development. I did not provide one. The documents I had been organizing began to form patterns of their own. Dates aligned in ways I had not noticed before. Decisions clustered. Certain names appeared repeatedly, always in supporting roles, never central, yet somehow influential. I did not confront these observations. I recorded them mentally and moved on. Confrontation implies urgency. I was not urgent. I was thorough. I returned to my husband's study often, sometimes sitting there without opening a single drawer. The room had become a place of alignment rather than inquiry. Being there reminded me of how carefully he had lived, how little he trusted appearances alone. He believed deeply in systems, but never blindly. That distinction had once felt academic to me. Now it felt essential. The safe remained unopened. I was aware that this might appear strange to others, that curiosity alone should have driven me to it by now. But curiosity is not always productive. Sometimes it clouds judgment. I wanted clarity, not surprise. I wanted to be certain that when I turned the dial, I would understand not just what I found, but why it had been left. One afternoon, I received a call from the bank. The tone was courteous, professional, a routine matter, the representative said, a signature required, an update to account oversight. I listened carefully, asking neutral questions, offering no commentary. When the call ended, I wrote down the details and placed the note beside others like it. Alone, none of them meant much. Together, they suggested movement. I noticed then that decisions were still being made around me, though I was no longer invited to participate. That realization did not upset me, it sharpened me. It reminded me that exclusion is rarely passive. It requires maintenance, attention, consistency, the same qualities I had been cultivating quietly. One evening, while preparing dinner, I caught myself humming. The sound surprised me. It had been years since music had escaped me without prompting. I stopped, embarrassed, then continued. It was not happiness exactly. It was equilibrium, a sense that I was no longer bracing against loss, but standing alongside it. That night, I dreamed again of my husband. This time he was younger. He stood at the door of the study, holding it open, waiting. He did not gesture or speak. He simply looked at me with the expression he used when he trusted me to decide something difficult on my own. I woke with my heart steady, not racing, and knew the dream was not a summons. It was a reminder. The following morning, I entered the study and sat at his desk. I opened a drawer I had not touched before and found an envelope addressed to me. It was sealed, unmarked, its presence unannounced. My name was written in his hand, careful and unmistakable. I did not open it, not yet. I held it for a long time, feeling its weight, aware that timing matters more than discovery. I placed the envelope back where it had been and closed the drawer. Some truths, I understood, are not meant to be accessed in isolation. They require context, alignment, and readiness. I had learned patience too well to abandon it now. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a subtle shift in how I was treated by institutions. Calls were returned more promptly. Correspondence carried a slightly different tone, not respect exactly, recognition, as if my quiet presence had finally registered on some internal ledger. I did not draw attention to this change. I simply noted it. I continued to live carefully, observing more than acting, speaking only when necessary. My silence was no longer defensive, it was deliberate. I had stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. Instead, I focused on understanding how those decisions had been constructed. One afternoon, while filing papers, I paused and looked around the dining room. Sunlight spilled across the table where I had once hosted long dinners, conversations that stretched into night. I felt no bitterness, just distance. Distance, I realized, is not always imposed. Sometimes it is chosen, quietly, when proximity becomes a liability. That evening, as I passed the study, I stopped again. This time, I entered. I knelt in front of the safe and rested my hand against it, steady and sure. I did not open it, but I knew without hesitation that the moment was approaching, not because I felt threatened or desperate, but because the shape of the silence around me had changed. It was no longer empty. It was expectant, and I had learned enough to recognize the difference. I opened the safe on a morning that felt no different from any other. That was important to me. I did not want the act to be dramatic, to feel like a response to fear or pressure. I wanted it to feel earned. The house was quiet. The kettle had just clicked off in the kitchen. I closed the study door, knelt in front of the safe, and turned the dial with steady hands. Inside, everything was arranged exactly as my husband would have left it. No clutter, no excess. Documents grouped carefully, envelopes labeled in his precise handwriting, a small leather folder resting at the center as if it mattered most. I did not rush. I removed each item slowly, placing it on the floor beside me, reading only what was necessary to understand the structure before the content. It did not take long. What my husband had done was not dramatic. There were no secret fortunes hidden offshore, no sudden reversals meant to shock. What he had left behind was something far more deliberate. Safeguards, contingencies, documents prepared years in advance, activated only under specific conditions, conditions that, I realized quietly, had now been met. The leather folder contained legal instruments tied to property, trusts, and oversight authority, not ownership in the way people usually understand it, but control, conditional control. Clauses written with care, anticipating family disputes, external influence, and what he referred to in his notes as gradual displacement. The language was calm, unemotional. It did not accuse, it observed. At the bottom of the folder was the envelope I had found weeks earlier, the one addressed to me. I opened it and unfolded the letter inside. My husband's handwriting filled the page, familiar and steady. He did not explain himself. He trusted that I would understand. He wrote that love does not prevent manipulation, that good intentions are often exploited by those who mistake kindness for weakness. He wrote that if I was reading this, then something had already gone wrong, and that the documents enclosed were not meant to punish anyone, but to restore balance. I sat on the floor for a long time after reading it, not overwhelmed, not relieved, grounded. What I had sensed over the past year was now confirmed in ink and law. The financial restructuring I had been subjected to was incomplete, temporary, a surface-level shift that assumed I was uninformed. What it did not account for was the deeper framework my husband had put in place, one that did not announce itself until activated by exclusion and legal displacement. Later that day, I made 3 phone calls. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I asked questions, precise ones. I referenced document numbers, clauses, dates. Each conversation grew quieter as it progressed. Professionals recognize preparation when they hear it. They adjust their tone accordingly. Within a week, meetings were scheduled, not confrontational ones, administrative, necessary. I sat at long tables across from lawyers who had previously spoken over me. This time, they listened, not out of fear, but out of obligation. The documents required it. The authority had never fully left me. It had simply been waiting for confirmation that I needed it back. What emerged was not a sudden return of money, but something more consequential. Oversight of the trusts controlling my grandchildren's future, review authority over decisions made in my absence, legal recognition that certain actions taken without my consent had violated conditions set years earlier. The process unfolded quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. My son was informed by his legal team before I spoke to him. When he called, his voice was unsteady, not angry but confused. He asked why I had not told him. I told him calmly that I had not been asked. Silence filled the space between us. He said he needed time to understand. I told him he should take it. The bank corrected its posture immediately. Accounts were frozen pending review. Signatures were reevaluated. The word temporary appeared again, this time attached to arrangements that once felt permanent. No one apologized. Apologies were unnecessary. Systems do not express regret. They respond to leverage. I did not celebrate. I did not inform friends. I did not feel victorious. What I felt was alignment. The quiet sense that the ground beneath me had stopped shifting, that I was no longer reacting to events, but participating in them on equal footing. The most difficult moment came not in a meeting or a call, but alone in my kitchen. I realized then that clarity does not erase grief. Knowing the truth did not return my grandchildren to me. It did not repair what had been fractured. It simply removed illusion. And illusion, I had learned, is heavier than loss. By the end of the month, formal notices were sent, legal standings adjusted, authority redistributed according to conditions long ignored. The process was calm enough that most people would not have recognized it as a reversal at all. It looked from the outside like refinement. Internally, It was a correction. My son did not come to see me. He sent messages instead, careful, measured. He spoke of misunderstandings, of pressure, of intentions that had not translated as expected. I read them without judgment. I did not respond right away. I was no longer obligated to soothe confusion that had been created without my participation. One evening, as I returned the documents to the safe, I paused over my husband's letter once more. He had not promised protection, he had offered preparation. The difference mattered. Protection implies rescue, preparation assumes strength. I closed the safe and locked it, not because I was afraid of losing what it contained, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. What remained now was consequence, and consequence moves more slowly than revelation. As I turned off the study light, I felt something settle into its final place. The truth had surfaced without noise, without accusation, without revenge. It had arrived the way all enduring things do, quietly, and nothing around me would ever be quite as simple again. The weeks that followed did not feel dramatic. There were no confrontations, no raised voices, no sudden appearances at my door. What changed instead was texture. Conversations grew more careful, messages arrived less frequently, then stopped altogether. The silence between my son and me shifted again, no longer defined by uncertainty, but by consequence. We were no longer waiting for the same thing. I noticed the change first in myself. I no longer checked my phone in the morning with any expectation. I no longer rehearsed explanations in my head. Whatever needed to be said had already been said, either through documents or through absence. That realization brought with it a strange calm, not the kind that soothes, but the kind that clarifies. The legal process continued quietly in the background. Reviews were conducted, conditions enforced, oversight adjusted. I attended meetings when required, spoke when asked, and otherwise allowed the machinery to do what it was designed to do. I did not interfere. I did not attempt to steer outcomes beyond what was already outlined. There was no satisfaction in watching systems correct themselves, only relief that they finally had. My son sent one final message. It arrived late in the evening, its tone careful, almost unfamiliar. He wrote that he felt blindsided, that he wished things had been handled differently, that he hoped, in time, we could speak openly again. I read the message once, then again the next morning. I did not doubt his sincerity. I also did not confuse it with accountability. I did not reply. Not out of spite, not to punish, but because responding would have required me to minimize something that had already cost too much. Silence in this moment was not avoidance, it was accuracy. It reflected the distance that had been chosen long before I was informed of it. I learned through intermediaries that the children were confused, that they asked questions, that explanations were being offered gently, selectively. I held that knowledge carefully. Children deserve truth, but they rarely receive it all at once. I trusted that whatever they were told would change over time, shaped by observation rather than instruction. That is how most truths arrive. Spring turned into summer. The house grew warmer, lighter. I opened windows and let air move through rooms that had been closed too long. I rearranged furniture slightly, not to erase the past, but to make space for what remained. Some objects were put away, others returned to view. It felt like editing rather than clearing. I stopped attending certain gatherings. Invitations came, then slowed. People sense when stories are no longer available for retelling. I did not mind. I had grown tired of being a topic. I preferred being a person again, even if that meant being less visible. One afternoon, I found myself in the garden, pulling weeds slowly, deliberately. The work was physical, grounding, Dirt under my nails reminded me that growth and removal are part of the same process. You cannot preserve everything without eventually suffocating it. That understanding felt earned. There were moments when grief surfaced unexpectedly, not sharp, not overwhelming, but persistent. A memory of my grandson's laugh, the weight of my granddaughter asleep against my shoulder years ago. Those moments did not undo my resolve. They simply reminded me of what had mattered and still did, even without access. I spoke to my husband more often then, not aloud, but in thought. I thanked him for his foresight, yes, but more than that, for trusting me with it. He had not tried to control outcomes from beyond his life. He had left room for judgment, for timing, for my own strength to meet the moment when it arrived. By late summer, the legal matters reached their natural conclusion. Authority was established clearly, oversight defined. The system settled into its corrected shape. I signed final papers without ceremony and returned home to an ordinary afternoon. No one called to mark the occasion. No one needed to. The change was structural, not performative. I realized then that separation does not always announce itself as loss. Sometimes it feels like space opening where tension once lived, space you did not know you needed until it appeared. I began to fill that space carefully, not with replacements, but with presence. I joined a small local group that met weekly, not to discuss grief or family, but to read and think together. I enjoyed listening more than speaking. There was comfort in being known only for what I contributed in the moment, not for my history. I was not someone's mother there. I was simply myself. Occasionally, I wondered if my son would reach out again. The thought did not trouble me. If he did, I would listen. If he did not, I would continue. Reconciliation, I had learned, is not always the highest form of peace. Sometimes clarity is. As summer faded, I stood once more in my husband's study and looked around. The room no longer felt like a shrine or a strategy space. It felt complete. I closed the door gently and left it that way, not out of reverence, but because I no longer needed to return there. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror and paused. The woman looking back at me appeared older, yes, but steadier, less inclined to explain, less willing to be rearranged by other people's comfort. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply acknowledged her. I went to sleep without waiting for anything to change, aware that the separation I was living was no longer an injury, but a boundary, and that boundaries, once respected, create a different kind of freedom. The story was not over yet, but it had finally stopped hurting in the same places. Time did what I no longer tried to force it to do. It moved forward without apology, carrying me with it gently, without resistance. By the time another year passed, the absence of my son and grandchildren had settled into something quieter than pain. It was not acceptance in the way people like to describe it, wrapped in forgiveness or hope. It was recognition. Recognition that some relationships do not end in explosions. They fade, not because love was false, but because alignment was lost. My days became my own in a way they had never been before, not even when my husband was alive. Back then, life had been shared, negotiated, shaped around responsibility. Now, responsibility belonged only to me, and I found that I carried it well. Mornings were slow. I read the paper cover to cover. I cooked meals I liked, not meals designed to please. I walked when I wanted, rested when I needed. No one interpreted my choices as messages anymore. The garden became my favorite place. I learned its rhythms, when to prune, when to wait. Plants respond honestly to care. They do not manipulate outcomes. If something fails to grow, the reason is usually clear. I appreciated that simplicity. It reminded me that not all systems are built to confuse. Occasionally, news reached me about my son through distant channels. He had adjusted, life continued, the children were growing quickly, as children do. I felt a familiar ache at those updates, but it did not unseat me. Love does not disappear when proximity ends, it simply changes shape. I carried it quietly without asking it to fix anything. I never reached out again, and neither did he. That mutual silence became its own agreement, one neither of us announced, but both respected. I understood now that reconciliation is not always proof of growth. Sometimes restraint is. The foundation I eventually established was modest, intentionally so. I did not attach my name to it publicly. It did not need to announce its origin. It existed to support older women navigating legal confusion, family displacement, quiet forms of erasure that rarely make headlines. I listened to their stories more than I spoke. I recognized myself in many of them, not in their circumstances, but in their restraint. Silence, I learned, is a language women are taught early. Few are taught how to translate it back into power. I did not think of the money often. Wealth, once stripped of its symbolism, is simply a tool. It can build or obscure. I used it carefully, deliberately, without spectacle. That felt right. My husband would have approved, not because of the outcome, but because of the process. His photograph remained on my bedside table. I still spoke to it sometimes, usually at night, usually without words. Gratitude does not always require articulation. Some bonds exist beyond explanation, beyond time. He had not saved me. He had trusted me. That distinction mattered more than anything else he could have given. There were days when I missed the version of myself that believed endurance alone could preserve connection. That woman had been loyal, patient, hopeful. She had also been unprepared for how easily loyalty can be leveraged against you. I did not regret being her. I simply no longer needed to remain her. On a quiet afternoon, years later, I found myself sorting through old photographs. I lingered over one of my grandchildren as toddlers, their faces round, their smiles unguarded. I did not cry. I smiled softly and placed the photo back in its box. Memory does not require possession to remain alive. I understood then that peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the absence of self-betrayal. I had stopped betraying myself the moment I stopped explaining my worth to people who benefited from misunderstanding it. My life now is smaller in appearance, larger in truth. I host fewer people, but I am fully present with those who remain. I speak when I mean something. I am quiet when I do not. I do not chase closure. I allow meaning to arrive naturally. Sometimes in the evening, I sit by the window and watch the light change. I think about all that was lost and all that was revealed in the same movement. I think about how strength is often invisible until it is required. And I think about how easily silence is mistaken for weakness by those who have never learned how much it can hold. I do not know what my son tells his children about me. I no longer need to. They will grow, and in time they will understand that every family has its quiet truths. Some are spoken, some are lived. As for me, I wake each day without waiting for permission. I live without rehearsing conversations that will never happen. I trust myself in ways I once outsourced to others. That trust is my inheritance now, and it is enough.